So today we are having Professor Colin Mackerras, Honorary Director of the Confucius Institute of Griffith University, to be visiting the Australian Studies Center of East China Normal University in Shanghai. It has been, a kind of visit that we have been anticipating and planning for many months, and finally we're having Colin here. And today actually we are going to talk, Colin and I will be talking about, China-Australia relations in the recent periods, which has been undergoing some upheavals and difficulties. Yes. So Colin, as we know that actually in the past year, China-Australia relations have been undergoing ups and downs. Sorry to say there have been many ups, but quite a lot of downs.
There's quite a lot of downs.
Yes, so what do you think? Indeed, actually, we have been, witnessing this kind of from the Australia side, some kind of quite animosity towards China in various fronts. Yeah. So, what's your estimate of the general, understanding of the China-Australia relations at present?
In Australia, or in general, my understanding.
Your understanding.
Well, my understanding is, as you said, that it's got some quite serious downs just at the moment. I'm not completely despairing of the whole thing, though, but let me talk about the downs first. I think in strategic terms, I think Australia, and Turnbull in particular, is far too pro-American and unnecessarily pro-American. And the way he continues to fawn on Trump, even though Trump wasn't particularly polite to him at the beginning, I think is rather unfortunate, and I don't think it's in Australia's national interests either. And the way that Turnbull has reacted to the South China Sea question, I think he's been unnecessarily pro-American. I think he's been too condemnatory of what China does, and I think it's quite unnecessary, and I don't think he understands the situation fully.
Talking about the South China Sea, like Australia is not a claimant.
No.
And so why do you think Australia has been acting so vehemently vocal in terms of the dispute?
Well, I find that very strange, and I think it's because of the American stance, the pro-American stance, and because he thinks that Turnbull thinks that that's going to get him favourites with the US and with some of the other people who are, like the Japanese, for example, who are quite anti-China on this issue. But I mean, I think it's a great mistake on his part. I think what he should be doing is keeping out of it. It's quite unnecessary for him to interfere in this matter, I think. Because, I mean, the whole question is very, very complicated. It's got a long history behind it. And China's claims have perfect legitimacy, in my opinion. And I don't think he needs to be involved at all.
So do you think Australia might be joining the freedom of navigation that has been promoted by the Americans, in particular in the context of Harry Harris being appointed as the...
I know, yes. I think, well, I mean, the government ministers, including Turnbull and Julie Bishop, have made several statements suggesting that they think the freedom of navigation issue is China's in the wrong, and they should be taking a pro-American stand. And again, I don't think that is legitimate, and I don't think it's necessary, and I don't think it's wise for them to take this position at all.
But Julie Bishop, I think she mentioned that actually Australia might be taking some kind of independent initiative to carry out a navigation cruise.
Yes, I know. She did say that. Well, I hope that doesn't happen, but I think it would be a great mistake if it did.
So what are the comments do you have about China-Australia relations in general?
Well, I mean, I think the main point I would like to make is that there's been this revival of this China threat theory, and especially with this attempt to criticise and even condemn a lot of Chinese students for taking part in trying to undermine Australian academic values, some people are claiming. And then this book by Clive Hamilton called Silent Invasion, which argues that China is trying to overturn Australian democracy. And it seems to me just total nonsense.
Yeah, just a fallacy.
A complete fantasy. And I think that for him to take up this position is very unfortunate. I mean, the fact is that several people have been trying to persuade Turnbull about this, including some people who are quite influential and who quite, have a long standing of relations with China. And Turnbull has introduced this foreign law, which is called a national security law. I mean, I don't know whether it'll go through. I hope not. But it is. When Turnbull introduced it, he specifically instanced China as an example where Australia needs to be careful of foreign influence. And I mean, to me, to put China ahead of all those countries like US, Israel, and various others, England, for example, Britain, and even France, and so on, it just seems ridiculous to me. And I just don't get it. And I think that it's being spread up for bad motives. I'm not sure how much the Americans are behind it, but it wouldn't surprise me if they were at least to some extent, prodding. I think it's mainly an Australian issue. But, I mean, it is very striking to me that people are talking about these Five Eyes, which means the US, Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And they've been
initially a kind of like intelligence sharing organization. But how could it be like a sort of like a shared value sort of like alliance?
Well, maybe it's something like that. I mean, but why they should be, ganging up on China, I just can't get it. I just think it is extremely unfortunate, and I think it's very wrong. And I think, as far as Australia is concerned, I think it's very much against our interests. I mean, there have been similar things in New Zealand, but the New Zealand government, I think, has taken a better position about this. They haven't allowed the country to be involved in some new Cold War, against Russia and China, but especially China, and that's the one that matters. I mean, my basic position on all this is that, first of all, I think it is quite unfounded. The evidence put forward is just not sound, and in some cases just no evidence for it. But the second point, I just really resent and deplore the effect that they don't seem to care that it's having a bad effect on Australia-China relations. I mean, look, for China, especially for Australia, China matters. It matters a great deal. It's the most important country, probably more important even than the United States, for Australia's foreign policy. And for Australia to be, goading China and insulting it in all these sorts of ways, just seems to me so unnecessary and so counterproductive and so stupid and so unfair. That's how I see it, and I just wish that they'd stop.
Talking about alliance, we cannot help but thinking of this kind of quadrilateral dialogue, so-called quadrilateral dialogue between America, Japan, India, and Australia. So it has been interpreted by China as a kind of like effort to contain China, in particular in the context that Australia is having this summit meeting with ASEAN countries and trying to make up an issue about South China Sea and other issues. So do you think really, this kind of like an arc, this kind of like a four-country arc can really be serving its purpose of containing China and to be sort of like contain China? Well,
I mean, I think that it's provocative to have that. I mean, as for containing China, I don't think that's necessary. I don't think it's not. I don't see China as a threat the way a lot of those people do. It seems to me provocative to have this quadrilateral thing. I mean, it's true that the United States and Japan and India, they all seem to be quite anti-China nowadays. But I think for Australia to join in this, I think the whole thing just seems to me to be provocative against China. And if I was looking at it from Beijing's point of view, I would see it as provocative and also unnecessary. And I would think of it as something that was specifically aimed against Beijing and against China. And I just don't think we should be in that sort of game nowadays. And I don't think Australia should be involved in anything that's even remotely like that.
Australia has not, signed a memorandum of understanding like New Zealand has done about Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah, that's right.
So why do you think Australia is holding itself away, back from this kind of like?
Well, I think that's a very good question, and I'm not sure the reason why it's doing it. I think it shows a general lack of enthusiasm for what China does, and I think, I put it in a big picture to context as well. It seems to me that in the world in general, US-based globalization is in retreat, and China-based globalization is on the increase. And I think one of the main reasons why it's on the increase is because of the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, that is a symptom and a cause. It's both. It's not the only thing that we can say, because I mean China has been rising and becoming more influential even before the Belt and Road Initiative began. But I think that's a big part of it. And I think Australia just doesn't like the whole thing. Australia sees itself as being part of the Western Alliance, and it doesn't want to stop being part of the Western Alliance, and it doesn't see, as I would argue, that it's not in its interest to continue to be on the same, dependency relationship with the United States. And I think, the West feels threatened by all this. That it feels that its day is getting past, and maybe in a way it is getting past. But I mean, I don't see that as being, I don't see China as trying to dominate things. No. I really don't see the signs of that. I mean, it's true that the West did dominate when it had the opportunity. And maybe the West, I know some theorists in the West think that domination is almost automatic. But I just don't see the things like that. I just don't think that China has a history of domination, and I don't see the signs that it's trying to dominate things now. I mean, the fact is that, Trump talks about America first and making America great again. Xi Jinping talks about common future and shared future, and he talks about mutual equality. Rather, he doesn't talk about domination, and I think that that's a much better way to go. And as for your question, why Australia doesn't join in the Belt and Road, I think it is a mistake. But I think it's based on this general feeling that it wants to stay in the Western Alliance and thinks the Western Alliance is here to stay, and that it's not in its interest to go with China. But I mean, in a way, I'd say it's not any unwise, but it's also very strange in the sense that China is now Australia's biggest trading partner, and it's likely to stay that way, and that has been very good for Australia, especially its economy. And I just think that Australia should be refocusing its foreign policy away from the United States and the American alliance and towards China. I mean, I'm not advocating that Australia should abrogate the ANZUS alliance, which was signed in 1951, but I'm certainly advocating that it should be downgraded. I mean, that's what happened with New Zealand. They successfully downgraded in the 1980s, and it continues to mean much less to them than it does to Australia. And I just don't think it's in Australia's national interest. I just make the main point: China matters for Australia. It's extremely important, and we should not do things that are going to threaten the relationship. And we certainly should not be doing things like Clive Hamilton is suggesting that will goad and make people unhappy. I just can't see the point of it, and I think it's most unfair.
Yeah, I don't think actually China is making Australia to make this choice about, the so-called China choice about either America or China.
Never suggested.
Yeah. So do you think there's any bipartisan differences towards, China or Belt and Road and other issues?
As Belt and Road, I'm not sure, but as for China in general, I don't really trust the Labour Party completely, but I will say that I think Penny Wong has been making some quite good statements lately, which suggest to me that Labour might be better for the China relationship. I'm not sure about it yet, but I think there's a good chance that will be the case. I mean, certainly Jacinda Ardern has been more, in New Zealand, has been more positive about China than Turnbull, even though they've tried to, get on and keep on good relations. That is New Zealand and Australia. They are on good relations. But answer to your question, I'm not sure, but I think there's a good chance that it would be better under Labour, and that some of the more extreme things like this new security law, I don't know whether Labour will end up supporting that, but I hope it doesn't go through.
Do you think Labour will win next year?
I do, actually, yes. Okay. I mean, it's very difficult to predict the future, but all the signs are pointing in that direction.
Yeah. So, and when we talk about this quadrilateral dialogue, we can't actually avoid, thinking of this Indo-Pacific strategy, so-called Indo-Pacific strategy. What do you think Australia's role is in this strategy, and what do you think Australia should actually be taking a response to this American-promoted, strategy?
Well, I think Australia's role is that it's part of this arc that you talked about. It's the southern side of it. But as for what it should be doing, well, I think it should be avoiding it and keeping out of it. I mean, I'm not against good relations with India. I think Australia should have good relations with India. I think Australia should have good relations with Japan too, and with other countries. But I think if it's going to take the shape that it's going to threaten relations with China, which it seems to be taking, then I'm dead against it. So that's how I feel about this quadrilateral.
In general, China is also attempting to improve relationship with Japan.
I know,
and also Modi is visiting China.
I know.
So all these signs are pointing towards a more optimistic future in the regional and also even international relationship. So what's your general outlook about China-Australia relations?
My general outlook is that in the short term, I'm not very optimistic, because I think that people like this Clive Hamilton and this national security law are not, that it seems to be getting worse just at the minute. But in the long term, I am optimistic. Why? Because I think that the overall trade relationship is improving. I think the cultural relationships are improving. And I think it is possible for Australia to take a different form of strategy. And I think that that's very much in Australia's interest. And I would say more independence, less US, more China. And I think that is likely to happen. The basis of it, of course, being the economic relationship. I think that's pointing in the right direction. So for those reasons, in the long term, I'm optimistic about the relationship. And I certainly hope that that's what happens, because I repeat again what I've already said, because I think it's so important. China matters for Australia.
Yes. As you say, that actually last year it was the 45th anniversary of our diplomatic relationship, and this year it is the 46th anniversary. So we hope actually this year both sides we can actually try to plan for a better improvement of the future, and really we are looking forward to better relationship instead of exacerbation of the bilateral relationship, which has been undergoing such upheavals. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much for having me on. I'm really pleased to be here. Okay.